In 1942, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences looked at Citizen Kane, a film that rewrote the rules of cinematography, of narrative structure, and of what a film could even be, and gave it one Oscar. One out of 9 nominations, and then they booed it. Citizen Kane is not just considered one of the greatest films ever made. For decades, it was the greatest film ever made, sitting at number one on the Sight and Sound critics poll for 50 years straight. Directors still study it, and film schools still teach it. The deep focus photography, the non-linear storytelling, the low-angle shots, and the ceilings, which nobody had put in a film before. All of it still feels alive and modern today, 80 years later. So how does a film like that walk into the Oscars with 9 nominations and walk out with just one win, a room full of enemies, and if you believe what Orson Welles said, a crowd that booed every single time his name was read out? That's what we're discussing today. To understand what happened at the 1942 Oscars, you have to go back further, back to before the film was even released. Citizen Kane tells the story of Charles Foster Kane, a newspaper magnate who builds an empire, accumulates power, loses his soul, and dies alone whispering a single word. And from almost the first frame, it was obvious to anyone paying attention who Charles Foster Kane really was. William Randolph Hearst was the most powerful media mogul in America, a man who owned 28 major newspapers reaching millions of readers every single day. Welles had tried to keep it quiet, and he denied the connection publicly, but Hearst found out through the gossip columnist Hedda Hopper, who attended a preview screening and immediately went to Hearst people. And when he did, he moved with the kind of speed and precision that only comes from having truly unlimited power. Hearst banned every one of his newspapers from advertising or reviewing the film. Not a single mention of the title was permitted in any publication he controlled. His papers launched a smear campaign against Welles personally, accusing him of communist sympathies, questioning his patriotism, using his private life against him. Major theatre chains refused to carry Citizen Kane, and Louis B. Mayer, head of MGM and one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, actually offered RKO Pictures $842,000 in cash to destroy the negative and every print of the film, just to erase it from existence. RKO's president, George Schaefer, refused, and that refusal almost certainly cost him his job. He was pushed out of the studio shortly afterwards. Think about what that means. The most powerful newspaper owner in the country and the head of one of the biggest studios in Hollywood were actively trying to make sure you never saw Citizen Kane. Not because it was bad, but because it was true. The film did eventually get a limited release. It was initially a box office flop, failing to recoup its production costs. The Hearst machine had done its job. By the time the Oscar nominations were announced, Citizen Kane was already a wounded film. Trailing behind it was a cloud of controversy, political toxicity, and institutional hostility. So, on February the 26th, 1942, the 14th Academy Awards take place at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. Context matters here. It's actually crazy to think that Pearl Harbor had just happened 11 weeks earlier. America had just entered the Second World War. The ceremony had actually been briefly cancelled in the immediate aftermath of the attack. The country was not in the mood for provocation or complexity, or a film that held a mirror up to the darker impulses of American power. Citizen Kane had managed 9 nominations: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor for Welles, Best Original Screenplay, and more. And according to the March 1942 edition of Variety, it was suggested that the nominations themselves were viewed as thinly veiled apology for how Welles had been treated and maligned by the Hearst papers. In other words, even the people giving him nominations didn't necessarily think he deserved them. They felt guilty. That's a very different thing. On the night, Citizen Kane lost Best Picture to How Green Was My Valley, Welles lost out on Director to John Ford, and he even lost the Best Actor award to Gary Cooper. But the screenplay did win, and many believe it won not for appreciation of Orson Welles, but for his co-writer, Herman J. Mankiewicz, otherwise known as Mank. Then there was the booing. This is where it gets complicated, because the only person who ever claimed Citizen Kane was booed every time its name was read out was Orson Welles himself, and Welles famously was not at the ceremony. He said later that every one of his 9 nominations was met with audible booing from the audience. So did it happen? Probably something like it, because Variety at the time noticed something extraordinary. It was patent that the mob didn't like the guy personally, and part of the reason for that comes down to something almost absurdly mundane: the extras. At the time, the roughly 6,000 film extras working in Hollywood were allowed to vote on Best Picture in the acting categories. 6,000 people who had watched this 26-year-old outsider waltz into Hollywood with complete creative control, no studio interference, and the audacity to make something genuinely new. And he would never bother to hide his contempt for the industry he was working in. Welles didn't play the game, he didn't schmooze, he didn't defer to his elders. He came in like a audio in the place, and Hollywood didn't forgive that. And then there's the other side of the story, the film that actually won. How Green Was My Valley, directed by John Ford. A period drama about a Welsh mining family in the 19th century, told through the nostalgic eyes of its youngest member looking back on his childhood. It won 5 Oscars that night: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actor, Best Cinematography, and Best Art Direction. The film often gets used as a punching bag, and it doesn't entirely deserve it. How Green Was My Valley is genuinely not a bad film. It's a beautifully shot, emotionally warm family drama, and it has real things to say about labour exploitation, the destruction of working class communities, the way industries hollow out the people who serve them. On its own terms, it holds up quite well, but it wasn't chosen on its own terms. It was chosen because of who directed it. John Ford was Hollywood royalty. He'd already won Best Director the previous year for The Grapes of Wrath. Winning for How Green Was My Valley gave him the third directing Oscar, a record that remains unmatched to this day. The Academy didn't just prefer Ford's film, they preferred Ford himself. The established master over the dangerous upstart, the industry insider over the boy who'd come in from radio and theatre and had the nerve to make the best film anyone had seen in years on his very first try. Wells himself called Ford the old master, and no one was a greater admirer of Ford than Wells. He understood exactly who he was up against. He just underestimated how much the industry would close ranks around one of its own. The Oscars, then as now, are not purely a measure of quality. They're a measure of momentum, of which film built the right kind of goodwill in the right rooms at the right time. Winning Best Picture has to do with the momentary passion, a surge in mood that rarely lasts beyond the year the film came out. Citizen Kane had too many enemies and not enough friends. How Green Was My Valley had John Ford. After the Oscars, Citizen Kane was returned to the RKO archives. Wells lost his creative freedom at the studio almost immediately. His next film, The Magnificent Amazons, was taken away from him in post-production and cut by nearly an hour by the studio. Many claim that if Wells was able to finish his version of The Amazons, it may have surpassed Citizen Kane and become the greatest film ever. He never again had the same control he'd had on Kane. He spent much of the rest of his career scrambling for funding, making films in pieces over years, acting in other people's movies to finance his own. And Citizen Kane just sat there, in a vault, largely unseen. It took 25 years for the reassessment to begin properly, for critics and filmmakers to go back and look at what Wells had actually done, the depth of field photography that Greg Toland pioneered, the overlapping dialogue, the narrative structure that moved backwards and forwards in time when every other film of the year moved in a straight line. By the time it hit number one on the Sight and Sound poll in 1962, Wells had already been effectively exiled from Hollywood for a decade. He died in 1985. He never made another film with the freedom that he'd made at 25. The most talented filmmaker of his generation was essentially destroyed by a combination of a billionaire's wounded ego, Hollywood's institutional snobbery, and his own refusal to be anything other than exactly what he was. In retrospect, it's easy to say that Citizen Kane deserved to win Best Picture in 1942, but as with everything in life, there's more to the story. It wasn't just beaten because people genuinely thought How Green Was My Valley was superior quality. I think the more interesting question is what this tells us about the Oscars, not just then, but in general. Because the forces that conspired against Citizen Kane in 1942 haven't gone anywhere. The institutional bias toward established names over genuine outsiders, the way powerful people can shape perception through the sheer weight of their influence, the preference for films that make you feel comfortable over films that make you feel challenged. Hearst is the obvious villain of this story, but Louis B. Mayer offered to burn the negative. The extras may have booed because they didn't like the guy personally. The Academy gave 9 nominations as a guilt offering and then voted against him anyway. Nobody in Hollywood wanted Citizen Kane to win. They just couldn't quite bring themselves to say it out loud. And that is, when you think about it, almost a more perfect story than anything Wells put on screen. The greatest film ever made, beaten not by a better film, but by politics, by power, by the same forces that Kane himself embodies. Orson Welles made a film about how America corrupts its great men, and then America corrupted him.